Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. It's been a while since we thought about this concept, but do you remember this talk by President Nelson? This is from the April 2024 General Conference, Rejoice in the Gift of Priesthood Keys. Right off the bat, he says, "My dear brothers and sisters, today is an historic day for President Dallin H. Oaks and me. It was 40 years ago, on April 7th, 1984, when we were sustained to the quorum of the 12 apostles." And then he has a footnote, and he points out, "I filled the vacancy in the quorum of the 12 left by the January 11th, 1983 death of Elder LeGrand Richards. Elder Oaks filled that which was left by the January 11th, 1984 death of Mark E. Peterson." In other words, those two previous apostles died exactly 1 year apart. Now, we've seen so many interesting things with President Nelson, specifically the numbers 7 as well as 11. And this is one case of that. January 11th, 111. It's shown up other times. But, back 2 years ago, even last year, we thought about the implication of this, them reaching 40 years as apostles, because 40 is a number that shows up a lot in the scriptures. It even shows up in this dispensation. For example, the time it took to construct the Salt Lake Temple. And with the number 40, I have a bunch of examples on my spreadsheet for numbers, but in short, typically what happens in the scriptures is you'll have 40 years of preparation or wandering or incubation or however you want to think of it. And then once the 40 years are over, then comes some type of destruction. So for example, you had the 40 days and 40 nights of rain with the flood in Noah. And after those 40 days and 40 nights, that's when the flood came, the way that it's told in the scriptures. Or with Israel, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They wandered, and then once it was time to enter the promised land, then came the destruction, not to Israel, but to the peoples that lived in the land that God had promised to Israel, because those different peoples were living in a wicked way. So we've thought about President Nelson, President Oaks being called together under unusual circumstances. I'm not going to go through that whole story. We've talked about the potential significance in their occupations and the symbolism in that. President Nelson being the heart surgeon, working on the heart of the church symbolically. And then President Oaks being the judge. And now, is it time for judgment? I don't know. Well, we're now in 2026. And now I'm thinking about 42 years. I don't know how I started thinking about this, but this idea just came to me. I was thinking, okay, so they've basically been apostles for 42 years now. And there is, well, as it turns out, 2 places in the scriptures where you see the number 42 that I'm tracking anyway. And one of those places is in the book of Revelation. It has to do with the 2 witnesses. Now, look, I know that me and my friend Caitlin with Anticipating Christ's Return, we've done so many 2 witnesses videos within the last year, I'd say. Both her and I are very flexible when it comes to prophecy. We don't get rigid. We don't just stay within a box. We're open to this prophecy however it plays out. Maybe some aspects are symbolic, maybe some are literal, maybe it's all literal, maybe it's all symbolic. I don't know. Recently I did a video about Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith because there's some really interesting parallels there. I wouldn't be surprised if they were the 2 witnesses. More on that at the end of the video. But you might be saying, well, you're talking about 42 years as apostles, not 42 months, because the 2 witnesses are supposed to preach to the Jews for 42 months. So they haven't preached to the Jews. Well, more on that at the end of the video. But first, let's tackle 42. So, I did a somewhat recent video. I think this was like last month. This is an article from Israel 365. It's called, let me go to the top. Rabbi says Bible verse number 5787 is a message from God. 2027 is the messianic deadline. And there's this whole like theory. I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but I'm interested to see how the Jews perceive the end times, even if it's just this individual rabbi's theory. I'm still interested because I think the Lord can speak to them in their own language, according to their own understanding, and they are all about numbers, let me tell you. But he points to the book of Daniel. There's a part that talks about, I'll just read this here. This is their translation into English. Lucky is the person who waits and reaches 1,335 days. So most people, I suppose English-speaking people, when reading like the King James version of the Bible, when reading that verse, they'd be like, oh, okay, 1,335 days. So let's think about, different periods of time that match that description. But what the article says next is the question is when to start counting those 1,335 years. So look, for some reason that I don't quite understand, in the scriptures, when we're talking about different periods of time, sometimes it's literal. It's just the way that it's written, years, months, whatever. But sometimes, and I think especially in the Old Testament, well, and I think also the book of Revelation, sometimes it's not necessarily a year, or it's not necessarily days, and maybe not necessarily months or weeks or years. Let me give you another example. In the book of Daniel, you have the concept of the 70 weeks of Daniel in chapter 9. And everybody agrees. I haven't seen anybody that doesn't agree. The 70 weeks were not literally 70 weeks. These were, most people interpret it as 70 periods. How's it go? 7 periods of 7. So if like each year is a day of the week, then 7 years would be a week. And so you take 70 of those. So 70 times 7, that's 490 years. And that basically matches up with actual history. If we go to my spreadsheet called Timeline Second Coming, we go back to the time of Christ. And this is not precise. I don't think anybody has a precise calculation, but it does roughly line up. When you get to that 70th week, that basically matches up with Christ and his crucifixion and atonement, resurrection, the Messiah being cut off. And if you go all the way back to the first week, it roughly lines up with the year 444 BC, when the walls of Jerusalem began to be rebuilt, because that's essentially what kicks off the 70 weeks of Daniel. So many years, not weeks, many, many, many years, 490 years approximately. And then in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, we have a Joseph Smith translation where in the King James Version, it talks about the woman fleeing into the wilderness and that she would be there for 1,203 score days. Days. But the Joseph Smith translation changes it to years. Years. For all I know, maybe it was written down correctly the first time as days, but now that this has taken place, the Joseph Smith translation reveals or shows us that It wasn't in term the great the great apostasy wasn't in terms of days. It was in terms of years. The better part of a couple thousand years. So so there you go. There you have a few different examples as we think about 42 months in how maybe it's not months. Maybe it's 42 years, or maybe it's something else. Do you see what I mean? I don't think it's too much of a jump to say that it may not be 42 months. I realize if we go further up on this spreadsheet, you have all these different ways that 3.5 are expressed. Sometimes in terms of weeks, sometimes in terms of days, and so forth. But anyway, let's move on. Okay, so let's go back really quick to the concept of 40 before we start talking about 42 and President Nelson and President Oaks. I just want to point out this is my spreadsheet called quotes numbers. President Oaks, in a June 3rd, 2024 social media post, he said, "This year marks 40 years since President Russell M. Nelson and I were both called, sustained, and set apart as apostles in the Quorum of the 12. So, you might expect that. It's a round number, it's a milestone. So maybe it's not like significant as far as what the Lord is doing with them, but it could be. I just want to point out that they both pointed that out. And then what's interesting as well is if you go back to the April 1984 General Conference, we have this from President Gordon B. Hinckley, at the time second counselor in the first presidency. He said, "We have enjoyed a conference that has been remarkable, I think in a number of ways. The naming of 2 men to the Council of the 12 on one occasion is something that has not happened in a long while. The last time it happened was 40 years ago, when President Kimball and President Benson were so named." Well, and then those two ended up becoming prophets. So here we are, 40 years before they were called. Now we've reached 40 years of their apostleship, and we're on 42 years. In fact, I asked Grok just to get the exact numbers. So President Nelson served as an apostle for 41 years, 5 months, and 20 days. And then President Oaks, still being alive, he has served for 42 years and 25 days as of today, the day that I'm making this. So for President Nelson, almost 42 years. And then President Oaks, he has reached 42 years. Okay, back to this, my numbers spreadsheet. I should point out a couple of things. This is a spreadsheet that I still haven't named, but it represents the amount of time that President Nelson served as president of the church, from his first day as president of the church until his funeral. And it turns out, I've color coded it so it's easier to see, and I have accounted for leap years. It turns out that he served as president of the church, or from the time he became president of the church to his funeral, it was 7 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, here in blue, 7 months in this like yellow goldish color, 7 weeks in pink, and then almost exactly 7 days. Now, my friend Christian Fire Poppy, she did this. This is where I found this out from, was her. She's she's really good with numbers. She started it from the time I think that President Monson passed away. And I think she said that from, if you start the clock then that takes you exactly to the day that President Nelson passed away. 7 years, 7 months, 7 weeks, 7 days, which brings you, which she says brings you to September 27th. I haven't done that yet. I've been meaning to do it, but I don't feel like doing it right now. But I just want to point out that's very interesting. It's interesting that he would even come close, that he would even like serve for 7 years just in general, but like as precise as 7 years, 7 months, and then further still 7 weeks. So it's just, we saw a lot of sevens with President Nelson's presidency. One other thing, really quick. Um, there's this really interesting thing. This is the Living Christ. It came out on January 1st of the year 2000. Um, the only ones that are alive right now that signed this is President Oaks and President Eyring. But one thing that we've talked about on the channel is the fact that you have this. So they signed by order of seniority, right? So right here, you have Russell M. Nelson. So Russell M. And then Dallin H. Oaks. And then after that, M. Russell Ballard. You may think it's silly, that's fine. But it's so unlikely that you would have two apostles. One would be Russell M. And then the other one would be M. Russell. And then in between them, almost like their names and initials are pointing toward the middle, you have President Oaks. Of these 15 apostles that signed, President Nelson was right in the middle, right here. But I do wonder if, if really President Oaks is being pointed to, if he could be the president of the church at the time of the second coming. We've just seen so many interesting things. Oh, by the way, the Living Christ. I don't have it pulled up right now. I have another document that shows this, but I think if you take the title and like the subtitle, this is exactly 700 words. Exactly 700 words, this document. I've shown that before on the channel. You can do it yourself. Count it up, whatever you want to do. But so you see, I don't know what it means. I feel like I kind of understand some of the symbolism behind some of these numbers. But it feels like the Lord does have an order to things, and maybe it's not for us to calculate. Maybe it's supposed to be like a sign to them. Maybe it's like a personal thing. I don't know, but we see it. And so I'm just going to take note. Okay. Now 42. So we've talked about the fact that the two witnesses, it says in Revelation, I think in a couple places actually, Revelation 13, verse 5, 42 months. And then you also have it, Revelation 11, verse 2, 42 months. Okay. So yeah, President Nelson and President Oaks, who have come in together, there's just been these really interesting things between them. We've already covered some of it. I'd have to do an entire other video to cover all of it, but there's been a lot of interesting things. President Nelson has now passed away. I don't know that that necessarily matters because, again, prophecy may play out in a different way than what you expect. They may not die exactly at the same time. It may not be exactly 42 years that they have to serve just around that time. So I'm just trying to think outside the box. But 42, another thing that I came across was this. I didn't know this until today. I did a search and found out that the Jews, they find, at least some of them, find some significance in the book of Numbers. Let me move my picture down here. The book of Numbers, chapter 33, verses 3 through 49. So this is like it's like a travel log of sorts, just noting all the different places that the Israelites camped while they were wandering in the wilderness. This is something that I never would have paid attention to. It's like when you get these genealogies, you're just like, oh my gosh, who cares? You know that it's like significant, but for you, it's like, I don't need to read this. Well, it turns out that there were 42 places that they camped in the wilderness. You can see it here. I have it color coded. So I have like red and orange. That's like the first set of 10 locations. And then green and blue is the next set of 10. And then purple, and then back to red. And then you have the final two right here in green and blue. There are indeed 42 places after they left Egypt in which they encamped. So this is similar, and it seems like it kind of goes along with the number 40. I don't know why it's 42, but like you have two more than 40. But whatever the case, 40 years and 42 different places where they camped. And so it seems like there could be a similar thing going on here. I also have it on my spreadsheet and have it color coded. You can see it right here. So 40 and 42 in this story, anyway, representing wandering in the wilderness, leaving the world, leaving Egypt, and getting ready to possess the promised land, which I have said before. I feel like this story, I think it points to and parallels a number of different things. One of which is this dispensation in preparing for the second coming and gathering scattered Israel, in preparing for the second coming and inheriting the earth, our promised land. The saints will inherit the earth. And so we've talked about the interesting fact that you have Moses and Joshua and Caleb. They were the only three who had originally lived in Egypt who survived the 40 years. Everybody else who had lived in Egypt had passed away. So now you had an entirely new generation. So you had a people that had been through the refiner's fire and were now worthy and prepared to inherit the promised land. So, and what's interesting is it starts with the story of Jericho. And sorry if this is repetitive, but the story of Jericho is the first time in Scripture that you see 7 trumpets. The next time that you see 7 trumpets is in the book of Revelation. And it has to do with, judgments that are poured out upon the earth in preparation for the second coming. So you have it in the story of Jericho, you have it in the book of Revelation, and then you have 2 more sets of trumpets in Doctrine and Covenants, section 88. And both of those have to do with the second coming in the millennium. So, sorry. So this story, 40 years, 42 places of encampment, only 3 survived the journey from Egypt. And so they were very old. The Bible talks about the fact that Moses was really old. And he led Israel up to the promised land, but he did not enter it himself. Interesting how President Nelson, he was noted for his age, among many other things. He made it to 101 years old. And now we have President Oaks, who is also old. He's, I think he's 90 right now, right? Is he 90 right now? He hasn't turned 91 yet, has he? I haven't checked. But could President Oaks be the Joshua, the one that's going to lead us into the second coming in the millennium? President Eyring, he is also old. He is, let me just double check. I already know this. He is also in his 90s. I have a spreadsheet that shows that the presidency of President Nelson was the oldest that we have ever had in the church, where all members of the first presidency were in their 90s, and then later on, President Nelson went into his 100s. At one point, you had the first presidency; they were all in their 90s, and President Ballard was also in his 90s, the acting president of the Quorum of the 12. So this is the oldest first presidency, well, it was the oldest first presidency that we've ever had in the church. So that also lines up with this whole idea. Um, okay, let's move on. So the two witnesses now don't just, I know I've read the scriptures having to do with the two witnesses. You don't need to be like, well, Jared, what about this part? Or Jared, what about this? It might not happen the way that you think it will. Things could play out in ways that you don't expect. So, for example, right now, we're going to talk about the Jews because undoubtedly some will say, well, they're supposed to preach to the Jews. Okay, well, let's look at who the Jews are. Let's look at an alternative because sometimes we just immediately think we take the path of the least of resistance, the most obvious thing. Oh, it's the Jews in Jerusalem. And that could be. It could be. But let's look at the Book of Mormon in a couple different places. 2 Nephi chapter 30, verse 4. And then shall the remnant of our seed, so the children of Lehi, and then shall the remnant of our seed know concerning us how that we came from Jerusalem, and that they are descendants of the Jews. Doctrine and Covenants 19, verse 27. Which is my word to the Gentile, that soon it may go to the Jew, of whom the Lamanites are a remnant, that they may believe the gospel and look not for a Messiah to come who has already come. The Lamanites, the inhabitants, the Native Americans, the blood of Lehi's family that are in the Americas, the Lamanites, Jews. They're referred to as Jews in these scriptures. So maybe we can think a little bit outside the box and consider some other possibilities. So, for example, and I put this, if you need to refer to this again, I put this on my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. The new row 371 for Lamanites, Jews. And I think that there's more that I can add to this, but I'll do that in the future. In a recent video, I talked about Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith potentially fulfilling this prophecy of the two witnesses, or maybe being a foreshadowing. But you have this interesting thing where Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith to this day are not buried where Joseph Smith wanted to be buried. He had a sepulcher, or he had like a tomb that was made. But Emma wanted him buried somewhere else, and since that time, the bodies have been moved a couple times. And now they're in the Smith family cemetery, but they still aren't where Joseph Smith commanded that he should be buried when he died. And so, yeah, he's not lying in the streets, but his body is not laid to rest the way that he would prefer. So I think that's interesting. Joseph Smith definitely preached to the Lamanites, maybe sometimes personally, but through the church, we have really gone out to the Lamanites. But here's a couple paintings of Joseph Smith literally teaching Lamanites. But there's also this to consider. As we think about the bigger picture, we think about what Joseph Smith did. And as we think about President Nelson and President Oaks and just the church as a whole, let's read a few of these. So this is row 623 for South America. This is a newsroom article, June 18th, 2025. This year marks 100 years since Elder Melvin J. Ballard, an apostle of the church, traveled to Argentina and offered a dedicatory prayer for the preaching of the gospel in South America. Or you could say, among the Lamanites, the remnants of the Lamanites, the remnants. You know that it's not just strictly Lamanites. Obviously, the Nephites and Lamanites and all the other groups, they mix together, but we generally term them as Lamanites. So for the preaching of the gospel in South America, among the Lamanites, on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1925. and asked God to open the hearts of the people in South America to be receptive to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Before leaving Argentina, Ballard predicted that the church would initially grow, quote, just as an oak, which is really interesting now that we have President Oaks, just as an oak grows slowly from an acorn. But he promised the day would come when, quote unquote, thousands would join the church here. There are currently over 4 million members of the Church of Jesus Christ in South America. We got this. This is Mark L. Grover, historian. This is June 18th, 2025. It's a Church News article. South America historian and author Mark L. Grover wrote to the Church News that two of the most important missionary events of the church was the sending of apostle missionaries to Great Britain in the 1840s and 1850s. Quote, the second event is the evolution of the church in Latin America, beginning in Mexico in the 1870s, but later, the beginning in Argentina in 1925. I have 1925 highlighted because that is the year after President Nelson was born. He was born in 1924. So basically, just a few months, maybe half a year, whatever, but less than a year after he was born, that's when this happened in South America proper. So the growth was slow, but after 1975/1980, the expansion was so great that the growth in Latin America changed the church, Grover said. Grover said that 2 American continents represent 80% of the baptized membership of the church. Quote, for that reason, I believe that 1925 is a watershed moment in church history, not for what happened in that year, but what occurred many years afterward. So that pretty well coincided with President Nelson and his birth. This is Elder Ronald A. Rasband, April 2025 General Conference. Last year, I was privileged to preside at the dedication of the Mendoza, Argentina temple. In my message, I referred to Elder Melvin J. Ballard's 1926 prophecy that the work of the Lord would grow slowly for a time in South America, just as an oak grows slowly from an acorn. It will not shoot up in a day, but thousands would join the church, and the nations of South America would become a quote-unquote power in the church. I saw that prophecy fulfilled right before my eyes. And then I want to point this out. So we have this from Joseph Smith originally, but I'm going to read this quote from President Brigham Young because it's easier to read. This is from Journal of Discourses. Suppose we are ready for it, and a great temple is to be built at the central point in Jackson County. Gentlemen, don't be startled, for if we don't go back there, our sons and daughters will, and a great temple will be built upon the consecrated spot, and a great many more besides that. The land of Joseph is the land of Zion, and it takes North and South America to make the land of Joseph. So Zion is one of those words that's pretty interchangeable with a few different things, sometimes with Jerusalem, sometimes with Mount Zion in Jerusalem, sometimes with the future New Jerusalem here in Jackson County, Missouri, sometimes the church as a whole. So when we talk about 2 witnesses and we talk about Jerusalem, or you could call it Zion, I don't know. Maybe a lot of the preaching that's was to be done by the 2 witnesses has already been done. Maybe in the way that the Jews think about Mashiach ben Yosef, or Messiah, the son of Joseph. They believe that there's these 2 Messiahs, the forerunner, the Messiah from Joseph, and then the Messiah that we think of as the Messiah from the lineage of David. But We have Joseph Smith. I'm not saying that that's doctrine, but it's interesting how that lines up really well with our church and what we've been doing. But you have Joseph Smith, and he initiated all this, and it has really, really affected the Lamanites, or the Jews, the remnant of the Jews that are here in America. And then you have this concept that we're talking about in this video. So I know it's a lot to think about. It's kind of scattered, but it's just something to think about. President Oaks is now, he's now completed 42 years as an apostle, and President Nelson got close to that. So, my opinion, I think that the second coming is closer. It's going to happen sooner than later. We'll just have to wait and see what actually happens, but just interesting things are happening, and we're seeing interesting numbers. All right, that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.